Croft had worked the Fenwick Grange kennels for 31 years before his hip gave out and the family moved him to the Gatehouse Lodge, where he could see the grounds from his armchair without having to walk them. He was not a man who missed much. He had watched 3 generations of the Aldrin line move through that estate, had watched the feared ones and the gentle ones and the ones who pretended to be neither, and he had learned, over 31 years, that an estate reveals its character in the small hours, when the performance is over and the lamps are low. He told this story to his daughter 3 weeks after it happened, because he could not stop thinking about it, and because he believed some things deserve a witness even when the witness is old and lame and watching from a window. The feared man's name, among his rivals and in the county land offices, was Aldrin, just the one name, the way a cold wind needs only one name. He was not a large man, but he had the quality, Croft had noticed, of making rooms feel smaller when he entered them. Staff straightened. Voices dropped. Even the hounds in the kennel yard would fall quiet when his car turned through the gate, as though the animals understood something about stillness and deference that no one had taught them. He was not cruel. Croft wanted to be clear about that. He had never seen Aldrin raise a hand or his voice. He did not need to. The authority was in the composure, in the long pause before he spoke, in the way a rival's solicitor had once arrived with a letter of complaint and left 40 minutes later having apologized for the postage. Nobody in the county pushed against Aldrin twice. His estate manager, a man named Pemberton, had worked the Grange for 12 years, and in that time had made himself indispensable in the way that certain people do, not through excellence but through the steady accumulation of complexity, so that no one was quite sure what would happen if he left. He managed the grazing leases, the boundary records, the seasonal labor accounts. He carried a leather satchel everywhere, fat with correspondence and maps, and he had a habit of answering questions before they were fully asked, which Croft had always found unsettling in a man who handled other people's money. The undercook had been taken on 6 weeks before the night in question, in the thin stretch between the autumn harvest accounts and the first real frost. She had answered an advertisement for kitchen work and had been redirected, somewhat apologetically, to the kennel yard, because the head groom had retired in September and no one else on staff would take the night shift in the cold. Her name was Marin. She was not young in the way that calls attention to itself, but she was not old either. She was simply herself, compact and steady, with the look of someone who had learned to move quietly in other people's houses. The senior housekeeper had assessed her in 30 seconds and assigned her the kennel passage and the cold water tap and a canvas apron, and that had been the sum of the introduction. Croft watched her from his lodge window in those first weeks. She did the work without complaint. She was good with the dogs, patient in the way that cannot be faked, crouching to their level, letting them come to her, never raising her voice when they were fractious. The prize hound, a liver-colored dog called simply the Major, had been difficult since the head groom's departure, restless and off his feed. Within 10 days of Marin's arrival, the Major was eating again. Croft noted this. He noted most things. On the night of the 14th of November, the Major was gone. Croft heard about it at 6 in the morning, through the lodge window he kept cracked even in the cold, because 31 years of listening through kennel walls had made him a light sleeper. He heard Pemberton speaking in the yard below, brisk, dismissive, carrying the particular tone of a man who wishes a problem to be smaller than it is. The dog had likely strayed, he said. It would come back. There was no need to wake the household. Croft, listening, felt the back of his neck go cold. The Major did not stray. He never had. And Pemberton's voice had the sound not of a man unconcerned, but of a man who had decided, in advance, to be unconcerned. He did not know, sitting at his lodge window, where Marin had been since midnight. He would learn later. She had gone out at 12:30 with the late feeding. She always did the last round herself, because one of the younger hounds had a nervous stomach and needed settling. She had found the Major's kennel empty and the latch unfastened from the outside, not from within. She had taken a lantern and gone into the lower orchard, because the orchard ditch was where the estate dogs sometimes sheltered in bad weather, and it was a cold night and getting colder. She found him at the far end of the ditch, his right foreleg caught in a rusted wire that had no business being there, his breathing shallow, one ear laid flat. He had not cried out. Marin worked the wire loose in the dark, slowly and without panic, talking to him the entire time in a low, even voice, the way she had talked to the difficult ones in the weeks before. When the leg was free, she examined it by lantern light, a deep gash, nothing broken, and she packed the wound with what she had in her apron pocket, which was a clean rag and the wool scarf from around her neck, and she gathered the dog to her and sat in the ditch. She had nothing to cover herself with. The ditch was damp and the night was raw. She reached into the shadow behind her and found Pemberton's satchel. It had been left in the kennel passage that evening. She had noticed it on her last round, and she had brought it out of instinct, thinking there might be something useful inside. There was not. There was only a thick fold of papers and maps. She drew them out and spread the largest one across her shoulders like a blanket, the dog's warm weight against her chest. She sat like that until first light. In the gray of 5 o'clock she looked at what she was holding. She was not a woman who read surveyor's documents as a habit, but she had lived long enough in the world to know what a land boundary map looked like, and she knew what Fenwick Grange's western border looked like because it had been described to her in her first week, when Pemberton had given all new staff a tour of the grounds and pointed out the fence lines. This map did not match that description. The boundary on this map ran 50 yards further east than it ought to have, cutting a wedge of grazing land, good, high land, out of Fenwick's holdings and into the adjacent property. And there were letters beneath the map, in Pemberton's handwriting, addressed to a name she did not recognize at a post box address in a town 12 miles away. She folded everything carefully and put it back in the satchel. She carried the dog in her arms up from the orchard as the house lamps came on, and she did not go to the kitchen entrance, and she did not send for the housekeeper, and she did not find Pemberton, though she passed him in the yard and felt his eyes follow her with a quality she did not examine too closely. She went to the main house passage and asked the overnight footman, quietly, to let Mr. Aldrin know that his dog had been found injured and that she needed to speak with him directly. The footman looked at her as though she had said something in a language he did not recognize. She waited. Croft saw Aldrin cross the yard at 10 minutes past 7. He had not seen the men move like that in 12 years, not hurrying, exactly, because Aldrin did not hurry, but purposeful in a way that had a different quality than his usual certainty. He went to the kitchen passage, where Marin was waiting with the major wrapped in a blanket, the dog's leg cleaned and dressed, the animal quiet and alert. Croft watched Aldrin kneel. He had not seen him kneel before. He knelt to the dog and ran his hand along the animal's flank, checked the dressing on the leg with a care that was entirely unperformed, said something low that Croft could not hear. Then he stood. He looked at Marin. Not the way the senior staff looked at her, past her, or through her, as at furniture. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just done something he cannot quite account for. She held out the satchel. Croft could not hear the words from the lodge window. He watched Marin speak, steadily, without drama, the way she did everything. He watched Aldrin take the satchel and open it and draw out the map. He watched the quality of stillness that came over him then, a stillness different from his usual composure, deeper than it, the kind that comes before a decision rather than after one. He folded the map, set it in his coat pocket, and said something to Marin. She nodded once. He turned toward the yard and said, without raising his voice, a single word that brought the overnight footman out at a run. Within the hour, Pemberton had been asked to present himself to the estate study. Croft learned the rest in pieces over the following days, from the cook and the senior housekeeper and eventually from the family's solicitor himself, who came out on the second day and stayed 3 hours. The boundary map was Pemberton's own work, a redrawing, patient and meticulous, built over 2 years to support a transfer of grazing lease income to a cousin's adjacent holding. The letters in the satchel named the cousin, named the arrangement, named the payments. Pemberton had needed the western boundary dispute to seem unresolved. A dog that had wandered the orchard ditch at night would have complicated his surveyor's claim to that strip of ground. The wire in the ditch was not old. It had been put there recently, to keep the dogs off. When the major had found the ditch anyway, someone had simply left the latch open. Whether Pemberton had intended the wire to catch the dog or only to discourage him was a question the solicitors took note of but did not pursue publicly. Pemberton was dismissed with no reference and no pension bond. The land correspondence was referred to the county authority. The cousin's lease was voided. It was managed quietly, the way Aldrin managed everything, with a thoroughness that left no room for appeal and no need for spectacle. On the afternoon of the second day, Aldrin came to the kennel yard himself. Croft watched this from his window. The major was out on a long lead, moving carefully on the mended leg, and Marin was walking him in slow circuits of the yard. Aldrin stood at the entrance and watched for a moment. Then he walked in and fell into step beside her. They went around the yard once without speaking, the dog between them. Croft could see them talking, could see the ease of it, which surprised him, because Aldrin was not at his ease with people, generally. She said something that made him stop walking and look at the dog, and then look at her, and something crossed his face that Croft had not seen there before. At the end of that week, Marin was given a settled wage and a written appointment as head of the kennel yard, the first woman to hold that position in the Grange's history. The appointment was made without comment, as though it had always been the obvious arrangement. The estate carried a different feeling after that. Croft noticed it from the lodge window, in the small things. The boundaries were resurveyed and confirmed. The grazing leases were brought in order. A second pair of hands was hired for the kennel yard, a boy from the village, quiet and willing. The major recovered fully and was given a new, wider kennel built against the south wall, out of the wind. And in the evenings, when the accounts were done and the house had settled, Aldrin would come out through the kitchen passage and cross the yard to the orchard gate, and Marin would be there with the major on a lead, walking the western boundary in the last of the light. Croft watched them from his window, the feared men and the kennel maid and the recovered dog, moving slowly along the edge of his own ground, not speaking much, not needing to. The dog walked between them, easy and unhurried. Croft had watched a great deal from that window. He had watched the estate's character reveal itself in the small hours, in the low light, when the performance was over. He thought, watching them now, that a man could learn more from a lost dog and a woman in a ditch than from 12 years of satchels and ledgers and the careful management of other people's boundaries. He was right about that. He had, in 31 years, been right about most things.